The moment he spoke, her heart skipped, though she would never admit it. It wasn't the words themselves, it was how he said them, the quiet weight behind the syllables, the way his eyes lingered just a moment too long. Mara didn't usually notice things like that. She wasn't the type to read too much into expressions or fleeting glances, yet somehow, this felt different. She had come to the library that evening to escape the hum of her apartment. The sky outside was a deep, velvety black, and the street lamps flickered against the edges of fog curling along the pavement. Bookshelves towered like quiet sentinels, and somewhere, distant footsteps echoed on the polished wooden floor. Mara pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders and exhaled slowly, trying to shake the sense of anticipation curling in her chest. And then he appeared. Not that he had to arrive dramatically, he just seemed to step into the space, naturally, as if he belonged there more than anywhere else. Julian. She had known him for a handful of weeks through a mutual friend, nothing more, and yet his presence had a way of settling around her, a warmth that felt like a slow, steady pulse she hadn't realized she was missing. "I didn't think I'd find anyone here at this hour," he said, his voice soft, almost teasing, yet not in a way that mocked. It was the kind of tone that made her want to listen. Really listen. Mara looked up from the book she had been pretending to read and tried to catch her breath without seeming too obvious. "I like the quiet," she replied, too casually. But her heart, traitor that it was, thumped loudly, betraying her calm tone. Julian smiled, a slow, thoughtful smile that made her blink. He tilted his head, watching her with that patient gaze she couldn't quite understand. "Quiet is nice," he said. Then, almost as an afterthought, "But some quiet carries more than silence. It carries waiting." Mara froze for a moment. The words felt strange and familiar at the same time. Was he referring to the waiting she hadn't even realized she had been doing? She swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. They wandered through the aisles, their conversation light but filled with an undercurrent she couldn't name. They laughed over small things, titles of forgotten novels, awkwardly mispronounced names of authors, but beneath the laughter, Mara sensed the invisible threads winding tighter between them. She wanted to reach out, to touch them, but instead, she let the moment stretch, long and fragile, like a thin sheet of ice on a pond. Then, without warning, he said the sentence. Just one, simple, unassuming sentence, but it landed in her chest like a stone. He didn't flinch as he spoke. He didn't look away. He just let it hang there in the air, between them, in the quiet glow of the overhead lamps. Mara couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. She could only notice. She noticed the way he looked at her after saying it, the intensity in his eyes, the softness at the edges, the hint of vulnerability he didn't try to hide. It was nothing like she had expected. Nothing like the casual acquaintance he had been moments before. She felt her own pulse race, aware that something in the balance between them had shifted forever. If she tried to analyze it, she would fail. Her mind scrambled, searching for logic, for reasoning, for any explanation that could make sense of this new weight in the room. But there was none. It was raw and immediate, and it belonged to the two of them in that quiet, hushed space. Mara shifted on her feet, trying to anchor herself, trying to let the words sink in without unraveling her completely. She wanted to respond, wanted to say something meaningful, but instead, she felt herself melting into the moment, trapped in the gravity of the look, the sentence, the pause between them. Outside, the fog thickened, casting the library windows in a muted silver haze. Inside, the world had narrowed to just the two of them, two people standing amidst towers of books, caught in the fragile tension of something unspoken yet profoundly felt. If you're enjoying this story so far, please like the video and subscribe for more heartfelt tales. Mara barely dared to move. She could feel the pull in Julian's gaze, and she wondered if he could sense the storm stirring inside her too. The seconds stretched, heavy with anticipation, as if the universe itself had paused to witness what might come next. And then, the quiet was broken not by words, but by the subtle shift of energy between them. Mara stepped back slightly, uncertain, aware that everything she thought she knew about him, about herself, about this ordinary Thursday evening, had just tilted on its axis. Mara's hands trembled slightly as she picked up the next book from the shelf, pretending it was the most natural thing in the world. Her mind, however, was anything but natural. Every thought, every heartbeat, seemed to loop back to that single sentence Julian had spoken. It wasn't the words themselves, anyone could have said them, but the way he said them, and more importantly, the way he looked at her afterward. She tried to steady her breathing. It was impossible to ignore the shift in the room, the subtle electricity that hummed just beneath the surface. Julian had moved closer to the window, his reflection faint in the glass, but still she could see the tension in his jaw, the softness in his eyes. It was the kind of gaze that made a person feel simultaneously fragile and alive. "Do you often stay until the library closes?" he asked, his tone casual, yet carefully measured. Mara shook her head slowly, trying not to overthink. "Not really. Just when I need to think." Her voice sounded smaller than intended. She cursed herself for sounding so ordinary, so unremarkable, when every part of her wanted to be more interesting, more confident, more present for him. Julian nodded thoughtfully. "Thinking is important. Sometimes more important than talking." He turned toward her, leaning slightly against the shelf, and for a moment, Mara's world narrowed to the slant of his shoulders, the quiet determination in his posture. She could feel herself wanting to reach out, not physically, but to close the gap that stretched between her thoughts and his words. There was a pause, long enough that she could hear the soft creak of the floorboards beneath her shoes. Somewhere, the clock ticked. Each tick was a reminder that time was moving forward, even if they were suspended in this shared moment, caught between sentences and silences. "I didn't expect to see you here," Julian said, almost as an afterthought, but his eyes never wavered from her face. Mara's chest tightened. The sentence was ordinary on the surface, but she felt its undercurrent, an unspoken acknowledgement that tonight was different. That something between them had shifted, and neither of them could ignore it. She wanted to respond with something clever or profound, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she simply nodded, hoping her expression conveyed at least a fraction of what she was feeling. Julian's gaze softened, and Mara felt herself melting into it, aware that she had never felt such a strange, thrilling vulnerability with anyone before. The library around them seemed to blur, fading into a haze of dim light and quiet shadows. Mara noticed the smell of old paper, the faint scent of the wooden shelves, and for the first time, she realized how grounding the details of a place could be when the mind was overwhelmed. She wanted to anchor herself here, to remember every tiny corner of this evening, because she had a sense that it would change everything. Julian moved closer, careful, deliberate, and Mara could feel the subtle shift in the space between them. She didn't flinch, though part of her wanted to step back. There was a danger in this closeness, the kind that came from feeling more than words could hold. And yet, it was impossible to resist. He gestured toward the table by the window, where a single lamp cast a warm circle of light. "Do you want to sit for a while? We can talk, or just read. Whatever feels right." His suggestion sounded simple, almost innocent, but Mara recognized the weight behind it, the invitation to linger, to let the moment stretch a little longer. She hesitated, her mind racing, then nodded. "Yes, that sounds nice." As they settled by the window, the silence between them wasn't awkward. It was charged, heavy with unspoken possibilities. Mara opened her book but barely looked at the pages, aware of Julian's presence just across from her. Every so often, their eyes met, lingering slightly longer each time, as if both were testing the invisible boundary that had appeared between them after that one sentence. She noticed the way he adjusted his sleeve, the subtle twitch of a finger, the way he seemed to glance at her with curiosity tempered by restraint. And each time, Mara felt herself pulled further into the orbit of his gaze, aware that whatever this was, it was fragile and precious, and completely out of her control. The quiet was interrupted by the soft hum of the heating system, the occasional shuffle of books, and the distant footsteps of a late-night visitor. And yet, Mara felt a bubble around them, a private world suspended in time, where every glance carried meaning, every small movement spoke volumes, and every pause held the potential for revelation. Then, almost without warning, Julian spoke again. Just a few words, seemingly casual, yet they landed like stones in Mara's chest, echoing long after the sound faded. She realized she had been holding her breath without knowing it, waiting for him to break the silence, waiting for the moment that would change the rhythm of their evening once more. The pause after his words was unbearable. Mara's gaze lingered on him, trying to decipher the meaning she knew was hidden just beneath the surface. And as she did, she sensed that the evening was far from over, that the night had more to reveal, and that whatever came next would leave its mark in ways she couldn't yet understand. Mara felt the weight of the silence pressing gently against her thoughts. Julian's words lingered in the air, unclaimed yet full of meaning. She stared at the lamp's warm glow, noticing the tiny dust motes dancing in the circle of light, and tried to steady her mind. It was impossible to stop noticing him, impossible to ignore the pull of his presence. He shifted slightly in his chair, the movement subtle but deliberate, and for a moment, Mara felt as if he were reading her thoughts, parsing her emotions with careful precision. She wished she could look away, wished she could appear composed, but instead, she found herself leaning in, drawn by a force she didn't want to resist. "Do you ever wonder about timing?" Julian asked quietly, breaking the silence. His voice was soft, reflective, and Mara felt it brush against her like a gentle wind. "Timing," she repeated, unsure how to respond. Her thoughts were tangled in the echo of the sentence he had spoken earlier, in the way his eyes had held her attention, in the strange warmth that had begun to settle in her chest. He nodded, eyes not leaving hers. "Yes. How a single moment can change everything. How one word, one glance, can shift the path we thought we were on." Mara swallowed. He made it sound so simple, so almost obvious, but her heart insisted it was anything but. One word, one glance, he had done it. And now, everything felt altered. She could feel it in the gentle ache in her ribs, in the way her pulse seemed to echo his calm intensity. They returned to the quiet of the library, letting the hum of the night wrap around them like a soft blanket. She watched him as he traced the edge of a book with his finger, absent-minded yet deliberate. It was intimate in a way that made her aware of herself, aware of her own longing, her own hesitations. She didn't dare breathe too loudly, for fear that it might shatter the fragile connection that had formed between them. Julian's gaze flicked up to meet hers, and Mara noticed the faintest smile tugging at the corner of his lips. It wasn't bold, it wasn't overwhelming, it was patient, gentle, and utterly impossible to ignore. Something in the way he looked at her made her feel like she was seen in a way she hadn't been before. And the vulnerability hidden in that look drew her in further, deeper than she expected. "I think," he began slowly, "sometimes we hide behind routine. We pretend to be okay with the ordinary, with the expected. But there are moments that demand we notice. Moments that demand we feel." Mara nodded, words failing her. She realized she didn't want to respond immediately. She wanted to linger in his voice, to hold on to the gravity of the moment before it dissolved into the normalcy of the outside world. Outside the window, the fog thickened, curling along the edges of the streetlights like pale smoke. Inside, the room felt warmer, intimate, as if the library had closed off the rest of the world and left them suspended in a pocket of quiet. She noticed her own heartbeat echoing in her ears, and the strange, thrilling awareness that each of Julian's movements seemed choreographed to the rhythm of her own pulse. Mara tried to anchor herself in the details, the books, the soft creak of the chair beneath him, the muted color of the night sky. Yet, no matter how much she tried, Julian's presence overwhelmed every thought. His gaze, that careful, patient observation, seemed to weigh her down and lift her up at the same time. Then he spoke again, a low murmur meant more for her than anyone else. "You notice things others overlook. I can tell." Her breath caught. She had never thought of herself as particularly perceptive, at least not in ways that mattered. And yet, he noticed. He noticed the small hesitations, the fleeting expressions, the subtle shifts in her posture. It was intimate without intrusion, personal without pressure. And for a moment, Mara felt a flicker of something fragile, something she couldn't quite name, taking root inside her. I don't know," she admitted softly, barely above a whisper. Her voice sounded strange even to her own ears, vulnerable and uncertain, yet honest. Julian's eyes softened further. "It's okay not to know. Some things aren't meant to be solved immediately. They're meant to be felt, understood slowly, quietly." Mara's chest tightened with the truth in his words. He was right. She didn't need to force herself into clarity, didn't need to define what this was between them. She only needed to stay present, to notice, to breathe, and perhaps to trust that some moments were meant to linger longer than others. The lamp flickered faintly, casting long shadows across the bookshelves, and Mara realized how late it must be. The library was nearly empty, save for a lone figure in the corner. And as she looked back at Julian, she felt that same tension she had felt earlier, the sense that something unspoken was hovering, ready to reveal itself if they could only hold the moment just a little longer. Her mind raced, yet her heart urged her to remain still. Whatever was coming next, she could sense it would not be ordinary. It would demand attention, presence, and courage. And Mara felt the pull, thrilling and terrifying all at once, toward whatever awaited in the quiet space between them. Mara shifted in her chair, aware of the weight of Julian's gaze resting on her like a quiet question. The library felt smaller now, as if the shelves and books themselves had leaned in to listen. Every small sound, her breathing, the scratch of her pen against paper, the shuffle of pages suddenly seemed amplified. She had never realized how loud silence could feel when it was shared. Julian leaned back slightly, letting his eyes drift over her face, not impatiently, but with a patience that unnerved and comforted her at the same time. Mara felt exposed, yet she didn't want to look away. There was something in the way he observed her that made her want to reveal pieces of herself she usually kept hidden. She caught herself tracing the edges of the book in her lap, pretending to focus, while secretly watching the subtle curve of his smile. "I wonder," he said softly, "how often people miss these moments. The ones that might change everything if only they noticed." Mara swallowed. She felt the sentence settle over her, heavy and warm. He wasn't speaking abstractly. She could feel it directed toward her, as if he were acknowledging the shift that had begun when he first spoke that sentence hours ago. She wanted to nod, to say something meaningful, but her words seemed to have dissolved into the quiet between them. Instead, she let herself breathe, letting the warmth of the lamp, the soft shadows, and the sound of his voice anchor her. Julian didn't press, didn't demand a response. He simply waited, and that made her heart ache with the gentleness of it. She realized that some moments didn't need words. Some moments demanded presence, observation, and quiet acceptance. Outside, the fog had thickened, curling around the street lamps like misty fingers. The distant hum of traffic felt distant indeed, as if the city had slipped away and left them suspended in this private bubble of time. Mara noticed the texture of the carpet under her feet, the muted gleam of the polished wood, and she clung to the ordinary details to ground herself against the extraordinary awareness of Julian's proximity. He shifted again, leaning forward slightly, resting an elbow on the table. The gesture was casual, yet the focus in his eyes made Mara feel as though every thought had been parsed, every unspoken word recognized. She realized then that she had been holding her breath without realizing it, waiting for the moment when he would speak again, when he would guide this delicate exchange toward something neither of them had anticipated. "I think," Julian continued quietly, "we spend too much time avoiding noticing, too much time letting the ordinary pass without acknowledging it. But the extraordinary is there if we dare to look." Mara felt her chest tighten. His words, gentle as they were, seemed to map the contours of her own thoughts, naming feelings she had barely acknowledged in herself. She felt the edges of something fragile but undeniable stretching between them, something that demanded recognition, but also respect. She looked up, catching his eyes once more, and in that instant, she understood why the library had felt so different tonight. It wasn't just the quiet, the fog, or the books. It was Julian. It was the way he had noticed her, really noticed her, in a way no one else had. And that awareness, that connection, had shifted everything. A small laugh escaped her lips, soft and almost nervous, and Julian's expression softened in response. Mara realized how rare it was to find someone who could inspire both excitement and calm, curiosity and patience, in equal measure. She wanted to savor it, hold on to it, but she also feared the vulnerability it brought with it. Do you ever feel like life is waiting for a single word or glance to tip it into something entirely new? Julian asked, leaning slightly closer. Mara's breath caught. She had felt it, yes, that subtle tipping, the delicate sway that had begun the moment he had spoken that sentence. Her heart felt fragile, exposed, but she also sensed a quiet strength in allowing herself to feel it fully. She nodded slowly, unable to form more words without losing their weight. The night pressed on, and the library's soft shadows seemed to stretch and shift around them. Every glance, every movement, every subtle expression seemed to carry the weight of unspoken meanings. Mara could feel herself moving along a precipice, a delicate balance of anticipation and apprehension, wondering how much further the night might carry them. Julian's gaze lingered longer than usual, and Mara realized that something unspoken hovered between them, a promise of understanding, a fragile connection waiting for acknowledgement. And in that suspended moment, she knew that the night had more revelations to offer, that the story was far from over, and that the next words exchanged could change the quiet intimacy they had cultivated forever. The library had emptied almost entirely, leaving only the soft hum of the heating system and the distant echo of her own movements. Mara's hands rested on the table, palms warm against the cool surface, and she realized she had been holding her breath without knowing it. Julian sat across from her, calm and steady, but she could feel the subtle tension in his posture, the quiet awareness that this night held significance neither of them could ignore. She tried to focus on the book in front of her, but her eyes kept drifting to him. Julian was reading, or pretending to, his fingers tracing the edge of the pages, but there was a gentleness in the way he moved, a careful patience that made her feel noticed in the most profound way. Not just seen, but understood. "I've been thinking," he said softly, his voice cutting through the quiet, "about how some moments demand we pay attention. And others demand we act." Mara's heart skipped. She wasn't sure what he meant, yet she felt the weight of his words settle inside her. There was something deliberate in his phrasing, a slow unfolding that made her aware of the fragile intimacy they had built over the past hours. She realized she wanted to respond, to speak, but the right words eluded her. He shifted, leaning slightly closer, though not in a way that pressed her, only in a way that invited her to share the space. Mara could feel the careful, quiet pull of connection stretching across the table, and she felt herself drawn toward it, aware that this was a rare and delicate trust forming in real time. "I noticed," Julian continued, his eyes meeting hers fully now, "how you notice things others don't. And it made me realize how much I want to be seen that way too." Mara's chest tightened. She had felt it, yes, the way he looked at her after that one sentence, the subtle gravity in his gaze that had lingered in her mind all evening. And now, hearing it spoken, she felt the culmination of hours of quiet tension and shared presence. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't rushed, it was simply profound. "I think," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I think I've been waiting for someone to see me like that." Julian's eyes softened, the faintest smile brushing his lips. "Then maybe we've both been waiting for the right moment." Mara felt a warmth bloom in her chest, a gentle lightness that mingled with the lingering tension. She realized that the night had not just been about noticing or being noticed, it had been about understanding the subtle layers of connection, about discovering the weight and beauty of unspoken words and the power of a single sentence to change everything. The lamp above them cast a soft glow, illuminating the quiet intimacy that had grown between them. She noticed the way his fingers moved over the book again, the slight tilt of his head, and the calm patience that had never wavered. It struck her that trust and attention could create their own kind of magic, one that didn't need grand gestures or overt declarations. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Mara felt the hum of the night around them, the distant fog outside, and the quiet library walls that seemed to hold their shared moments like precious artifacts. She realized that something essential had shifted, something subtle, yet undeniable. "I guess," she said finally, "the ordinary can be extraordinary if you notice it properly." Julian chuckled softly, and the sound felt like a confirmation of everything she had felt. "Exactly," he said. "Sometimes, it's the smallest things that change the most." They sat together in silence for a while longer, letting the night carry them gently forward. Mara felt a sense of calm settle over her, a quiet satisfaction that was both thrilling and grounding. She understood now that the power of noticing, of being present, had brought them to this point, and that every shared glance, every subtle exchange, had mattered more than she could have imagined. As the clock ticked past midnight, she realized that what had begun as a simple evening in the library had become a moment that would linger in her memory forever. Julian's gaze met hers one last time before they stood to leave, the unspoken connection between them carrying the weight of understanding, patience, and gentle acknowledgement. Mara stepped out into the foggy night, the world outside feeling different, yet somehow familiar. The ordinary streets, the soft glow of the streetlights, the quiet hum of the city, it all held new meaning now. She knew that the memory of this evening, of that single sentence, and the way he had looked at her afterward, would stay with her. A quiet, gentle reminder that noticing and being noticed could shift the course of an ordinary night into something extraordinary. And in that stillness, Mara felt a soft hope, a quiet certainty that some connections, once made, could never be undone, and that the smallest words, spoken at the right moment, had the power to change everything.